Stop! You're not allowed to touch that rifle!" the instructor shouted as he saw a woman with a visitor's badge step straight onto the Coronado range. The entire SEAL team burst out laughing, waiting for an awkward scene. But instead of trembling, she placed an old notebook marked with the number 29040 on the table, then lifted the rifle as if she had trained with it for thousands of hours. "Just a few more rounds and everything would be turned upside down. Don't look away, because if you leave now, you'll miss the shock that silenced the entire base and revealed a past hidden for a decade." Her name was Claire Donovan, 34 years old, a former Army medic, now working in a small emergency room in San Diego. In the eyes of her co-workers, Claire was just a slender, quiet woman who often chose the night shift and skillfully declined noisy parties. They were used to that compact figure leaning over patients, her quick hands tying tourniquets, bandaging wounds, adjusting monitors. To them, Claire was part of the blurred background of a chaotic shift, diligent, calm, but nothing remarkable. At the Coronado base, where the sun scorched the sand like fire and the sound of waves mixed with the cold clang of steel on the range, she was just a visitor. The shiny visitor badge on her chest made her stand out in a way not at all comfortable. She had come on a casual invitation from an old friend, an ex-teammate now serving with the SEALs. A harmless invite. "Come watch us train. It'll be fun." But in this air thick with gunpowder and discipline, the presence of a nurse looked like a wrong note in the score. Glances slid over her, tinged with curiosity, doubt, and even a little contempt. No one said it, but the silence was enough for Claire to feel it. What could a nurse possibly know about a SEAL sniper test? She sat quietly in the back row, both hands resting on an old notebook with frayed edges, its dark fabric cover faintly marked with a string of numbers no one cared to notice. Her slender fingers brushed across its surface as if caressing a keepsake. Behind that ordinary exterior, there was another world no one could guess. The range that morning was alive like a small festival. Laughter mingled with the thunder of gunfire. Young soldiers, their uniforms still stiff with starch, took turns showing off their skills. Bullets pierced targets, the electronic board blinked with scores, and the crowd cheered. In the stands, families and friends wore shorts and sunglasses, sipping paper cups of coffee. Everyone was excited except Claire. She sat there, posture straight but silent, eyes fixed on the distant targets. No cheers, no spark of amusement, only stillness. A kind of stillness carried only by those who had once lived through storms of bullets. A sudden gust of wind swept her hair, tugging at her sleeve. For an instant, sunlight revealed a small tattoo, not flowers or artistic symbols, but numbers. 33 degrees 25 minutes north, 117 degrees 37 minutes west. The coordinates of Coronado. A young soldier nearby chuckled, whispering to a friend, "Look, must be a tourist. Came to visit the base and got the coordinates tattooed to look cool." His friends burst out laughing, not bothering to hide it. Claire didn't turn her head. She only tugged her sleeve back down, covering the mark, then let her breath fall loose. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not defiant, not submissive. Just a shadow of a smile, hinting she knew more than they imagined. On the range, the SEAL instructor called out loudly, summoning the next name. A tall young man stepped up, muscles taut under his shirt. The crowd erupted in cheers again. Claire watched, without judgment, without excitement. In her eyes, every motion, every breath, every squeeze of the trigger was strangely familiar. As if her body was automatically recalling, even when her mind didn't try. 10 years ago, these sounds had been her heartbeat. Now they echoed like fragments from a dream. Yet one thing the crowd could never realize. For Claire, this range was not unfamiliar. It was part of a memory locked away. A memory she had never shared. The people around her kept their eyes glued to the scoreboard, cheering for each shot. Claire opened the notebook on her lap. Yellowed pages revealed old handwriting, smudged in places not by rain but perhaps by tears. Among the faded lines, one number stood out: 29040. To outsiders, it was meaningless, but to Claire, it was a verdict of silence, a number she had carried for 10 years, one no one in this crowd could ever understand. In California's golden sunlight, Claire sat amid the excitement yet seemed utterly apart. No one there knew that the quiet woman had walked places the map only marked with faint red smudges. No one knew that behind those calm eyes stretched a sky of memories filled with smoke, blood, and names never spoken again. She didn't need them to know. She didn't need to prove anything. But one thing was certain. Every great story begins with being underestimated. And here at Coronado today, that truth was about to repeat itself. While the laughter of the young soldiers still echoed through the stands, Claire sat unmoving like a stone amid crashing waves. No sharp reaction, no furrowed brow, only the faint tilt of her slender neck each time a moving target flipped up downrange. To outsiders, it looked like a meaningless habit. But to anyone who had spent their youth under helicopter rotors and desert winds, it carried another message. She could hear the rhythm of the wind. And then, when her sleeve slipped down, sunlight revealed a small tattoo, and the once boisterous scene seemed to quiet for a few beats. Not an elaborate design, just coordinates. 33 degrees 25 minutes, north 117 degrees 37 minutes west. To a thrill-seeker, it might be nothing more than a youthful stunt. But to certain seasoned eyes, it was the kind of tattoo a soldier bore to never forget where it all began. A mocking question slipped from the mouth of a young soldier, his tone no different from a casual elbow jab at a party, yet it was Claire's faint smile that unsettled a few onlookers. That smile neither resisted nor yielded, it reflected back the immaturity of the one who spoke. It implied that she knew far more than they thought, but wouldn't bother to explain. The sun climbed higher, the crowd kept cheering, rifles thundered one after another, but to Claire the sound wasn't noise anymore. It became a kind of music, a rhythm. Bullets striking wooden targets made steady pauses, and her eyes tracked them as if long accustomed. No one noticed her finger tapping lightly on the cover of the old notebook, 3 short beats, too long. A cadence familiar to any sniper who had ever trained at Coronado. That notebook, still resting in her hands, seemed to contain an entirely different life. On the corner of its cover, the number 29040 stood out more clearly under the bright light. A few specks of dust floated past, clinging to its surface, making it look like an artifact unearthed from the past. To others, it was just an old journal. But to Claire, it was proof of a time so dark that even the shadows hesitated to touch it. From the back row, an officer who had served in Afghanistan frowned slightly. He glanced at the tattoo, then at the notebook. For a moment, memories stirred of the rare women who had appeared on the front lines. Nurses, soldiers working quietly in storms of gunfire. They were often silent, disliking recognition, yet left traces in small details like this. He smiled to himself, as though he had stumbled upon a secret the noisy youngsters around him would never understand. Claire exhaled softly, her gaze drifting over the eager faces lighting up with each bullseye hit. Those faces were carefree, confident, untouched by the fear of nights that never saw dawn. A nameless feeling rose in her chest, not envy, not disdain. Something closer to pity for their innocence, tinged with humor and sadness. You think you're invincible, but soon enough, you'll learn. A bird suddenly swooped across the range, making the crowd laugh and forcing the shooter to pause. Only Claire blinked slowly. The image pulled her back to a far-off memory, another dusty field half a world away, when the call of a bird once stalled a firefight for a few fleeting seconds. Seconds her teammates used to drag a wounded man out of danger. Memories like that always hid beneath the surface, waiting for some small detail to ignite them, like embers flaring under ash. Her faint smile faded. She closed the notebook, resting it on her lap, hands interlaced. For a moment, she returned to the guise of normalcy, a female visitor, quiet, unremarkable. But the tattoo had been seen. And to those sharp enough to notice, that smile, that silence, they were signs that Claire wasn't the outsider they assumed. On the range, the command rang out, slicing the air. Next shooter. Boots stomped, metal clicked, the crowd roared. But amid the uproar there remained a strange void, a pocket of stillness that clung to Claire, as if her silence itself created a separate space, standing in complete contrast to the noise outside. A space filled with secrets. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. The wind from Coronado Bay swept hard, carrying the salt of the sea and the tang of gunpowder lingering on the range. When Claire stood, every pair of eyes turned toward her as if a stranger had wandered onto a Broadway stage mid-performance. Laughter broke out, messy, mocking, the restless buzz of a classroom catching someone in the middle of a prank. An instructor waved her off, shaking his head in irritation tinged with pity. To him, she was just a slight woman with no business stepping into a test forged for men who trained their bodies into steel with blood and sweat. His warning was curt, his voice sharp as metal striking the floor. This was not a game. Claire didn't flinch, didn't back away. She placed the old notebook on the table, opened the first page. The faded handwriting curled across the paper, faint but clear. Blue Phantom, Ghost 12, 2012. In that instant, the laughter cut off. Silence dropped over the crowd like someone had spoken a ghost's name in daylight. A few faces drained of color, eyes darting toward one another. Blue Phantom, the code name of an operation erased from public record, scrubbed clean from collective memory, surviving only in whispers over late-night drinks. Outsiders would never understand, but anyone who had ever heard the name knew to invoke Blue Phantom was to touch a secret, heavy with blood and bone. Claire bent slightly, her hand closing around the Mark 13 Mod 7, the SEAL's standard sniper rifle. The motion was smooth, natural, without a hint of hesitation. As if her body had been drilled for thousands of hours to handle this weapon alone. The metallic snap of the bolt, chambering around, rang out, crisp and cold, making a few onlookers swallow hard without realizing. The young soldiers who had laughed earlier were now silent. On their faces, mockery shifted into curiosity, then edged toward unease. Something about this woman, a quiet confidence, unforced and steady, made them feel suddenly small. The electronic board lit up, targets glowing. Claire pressed her eye to the scope, and the world outside disappeared. Only the distance stretched between her and the far-off silhouette. Her hands moved in rhythm. Deep inhale, slow exhale, breath held at still point. In that moment, she wasn't a quiet nurse in an ER. She was once more the shadow on an Afghan mountainside, where each shot wasn't a test but the line between life and death for an entire team. Nearby soldiers stopped talking without meaning to. A few shaded their eyes, narrowing their gaze as if to be sure this sight was real. An older instructor, one who had served in Iraq, inhaled sharply at the way Claire adjusted for wind. That wasn't curiosity. That was survival, ingrained muscle memory. The spectators behind still didn't grasp what was unfolding. To them, it was only a strange scene, a woman trying out a rifle. But in the hearts of those in uniform, the atmosphere had shifted. The name Blue Phantom still echoed like a warning bell. Claire steadied, breath held, her heartbeat measured. The noise of the crowd dissolved, leaving only the wind whispering through her ears. For one brief second, it felt as if time had reversed back to 2012, in a moonless night, Ghost 12 pinned behind a ridgeline. The image flickered, seared her chest with an ache. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked clean, tearing through the morning air, The bullet streaked like a silver line, vanishing toward the target. When the smoke thinned, every eye turned to the board. Silence. The numbers blinked bright. Perfect accuracy. But more than that, the trajectory matched the record that had stood unbroken for a decade. The entire range held its breath. No one moving. Claire lowered the rifle, her eyes steady. A faint smile touched her lips, not boastful, but a quiet acknowledgement to herself. The skills had never left. No one laughed now. The young soldiers glanced at each other, their eyes darting, searching for an explanation. But the truth was plain. A visitor, a nurse, had just replicated a shot none of them could match. The name Blue Phantom rang louder in the minds of those who knew. Could it be she had been there? Could she have been part of Ghost 12, the unit said to have vanished without a trace in Afghanistan's burning sands? A junior officer stood frozen, sweat beading at his temple. He remembered reports crossed out, pages sealed away. And now, all those buried memories stood before him, alive in the quiet figure of a woman they had dismissed. The gunfire erupted. The sound was dry, precise, snapping through the air like a racing heartbeat. 3 shots, 2 seconds. The first target burst dead center, the bullet hole clean as a perfect stitch. The second target was moving, yet the round cut through with precision, piercing the weak point most shooters could only dream of hitting. The third target wavered in the wind, its trajectory drifting, but Claire's shot landed on the exact same mark, punching through the very hole of the decade-old record. A hush fell across the range. No one clapped, no one cheered. The air seemed drained of sound, leaving only the metallic echo reverberating in everyone's chest. Then Claire lowered the rifle, pulled a small cloth, and gently wiped the barrel, her motion as calm as clearing a surgical table after an emergency procedure. Every eye followed, stunned by the natural ease of her movements. To her, this wasn't the moment of breaking a record. It was the memory of a habit that had never left. One last shot. 30 yards beyond the standard line. The bullet streaked forward, burning a red dot into the center of the electronic screen. The scoreboard flashed, then blazed. The 10-year record was broken. Claire showed no excitement. She only whispered, her voice softer than the wind. Just like that day. The words drifted into the air, needing no audience. Yet for those close enough, it carried like an echo of the past. A reminder of a time when victories were never celebrated, only marked in silence. The crowd remained frozen. Some spectators glanced at one another, bewildered, unable to grasp what had just happened. To them, it was only a stranger shattering a military contest. But to veterans, to those who knew of Blue Phantom, it was a sign of something else. In Claire's eyes there was no search for recognition. Her gaze was quiet, distant, as if seeing through paper targets into a fog of memory thick with smoke. There in the long night of 2012, gunfire had rung out not to break records, but to keep her teammates alive. Her hand still rested lightly on the rifle. Not possession, but respect, as though touching an old comrade who had shared her life and would never return. The eldest instructor, hair streaked with gray, narrowed his eyes. He had once heard of Ghost, 12 fragmented reports, rumors never printed in black and white. Now, before him, every detail, every movement, every shot confirmed what he had doubted for years. Some people still existed, carrying stories untold. Among the young soldiers, the ones who had laughed at Claire's entrance now lowered their heads in unease. Some swallowed hard, others glanced from the scoreboard to the slender woman, searching for an explanation, but no explanation would suffice. There was only one truth: skill like that could not be faked. The wind picked up, carrying with it the fading scent of gunpowder. Claire folded the cloth neatly and placed it atop the old notebook. In that moment, silence returned, not the silence of mockery, but of respect, of acknowledgement. The woman they had dismissed had just proven she was more than someone who knew how to shoot. She carried within her another kind of honor, the devotion of a medic, the resolve of a warrior who had stood at the edge of life and death. and in every shot they glimpsed the shadow of a past history had tried to erase. Claire did not lift her chin, nor stride off in pride. She simply returned to her seat, as if nothing remarkable had happened. But in the minds of every witness a truth was etched. This woman was not a visitor. She was living proof of what must never be forgotten. A field-grade officer stepped out of the line, his boots striking the concrete floor with sharp, clipped sounds that made the crowd fall silent. His eyes stopped on the notebook lying in front of Claire. He didn't look at the rifle, nor at the scoreboard flashing with record-breaking numbers. He looked only at the faded page, where a familiar signature rested in ink. For a few seconds his stern face changed. His aged eyes welled with tears, as if he were staring at a ghost made flesh in the middle of the range. It was the signature of the SEAL team leader who had fallen in Afghanistan in 2012, the man he had silently bowed his head for at every memorial. And now, that inked line appeared again in the hands of a nurse no one had guessed had once been there. The truth revealed itself. Claire was no outsider. She had been the medic of Ghost 12, the last to leave the blast zone when everything had collapsed, smoke and fire rising like hell itself. The one who had used her bare hands, no gloves, no weapons, to drag 3 teammates back from the edge of death. In Claire's memory, that moment remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The explosions shaking the earth, the blinding flash of light. The screams, the roar of helicopters overhead, the pounding of her heart out of rhythm. And amid the chaos, she had seen blood spreading across the sand, seen her own trembling hands clutching the torn uniform of a soldier slipping away. She remembered the stench of gunpowder mingled with the acrid smell of burned gauze. She remembered wounds torn wide open, with only minutes left to save a life. She remembered the fear gnawing at her but smothered by something greater: duty. She hadn't stayed behind to be a hero. She had stayed because she couldn't leave them. But when she returned, all she was given was silence. The files stamped classified, her name absent from the reports. No medals, no thank yous, no honors. As if Claire Donovan had never existed in Ghost 12. Instead of a place in history, she was left with a cold void. She came back like a shadow, working night shifts in a small hospital, hiding everything behind a calm gaze. And now, at the very moment of breaking the record, when the spotlight could have been hers, Claire bowed her head and slid the notebook back into her pocket. This victory wasn't hers. It belonged to the faces forever left behind on that distant ground. The crowd watched, but no one dared speak. No one saw her smile. The gentle curve from earlier had vanished, replaced by a heavy stillness. On Claire's face there was only composure, the look of someone long accustomed to being forgotten. Perhaps deep down she knew the shots she fired weren't to prove anything for herself. They were a message, a way to say that Ghost 12 had never disappeared, that their sacrifice was not in vain. A breeze from the ocean swept across the range, carrying grains of sand that settled on the notebook. Claire brushed them away, her hand tender as if wiping sweat from a wounded comrade's brow. In that instant, everything around the range seemed small compared to that single touch. There are victories meant to be displayed in glory, and there are victories meant only to be honored with a bowed head for those who are no longer here. Claire chose the latter. Among the young soldiers, one suddenly felt his throat tighten, unable to swallow. The jokes he had made earlier now hung heavy in the air. Awkwardly, he stared down at his boots, realizing there were things far beyond the grasp of youth. The gray-haired instructor turned slightly, trying to hide the emotion etched on his face. He knew well. Some stories are written in blood, never printed on paper. And now, he had just glimpsed a piece of that story. Claire returned to her seat, her hand gripping the notebook inside her jacket, her eyes fixed on the sea, where waves beat against the sand in steady rhythm. To her, that sound was not just the ocean, it was the heartbeat of her comrades, who would live forever in memory. This victory, this record, it wasn't for herself. It was for them. In the rows of the audience, the heavy silence stretched like a taut wire. Eyes that once held mockery shifted first to surprise, then slowly to respect. The young soldier who had mocked her earlier felt the weight on his shoulders. He stepped forward, his boots scraping against the concrete with a dry sound. His voice faltered, awkward, barely audible. An apology, clumsy but sincere. The older instructor, who had watched Claire from the moment she placed the notebook down, gave a small nod. He needed no flowery words. Just one steady line, resonant as an order. Not learned. She was there. We owe her thanks. The news spread quickly within the base, then beyond. No official statement, just a few blurry photos, a few shaky videos uploaded online. Local papers in San Diego ran a brief headline. Nurse breaks seal record after 10 years. No one mentioned Blue Phantom. No one dared write the words, Ghost 12. But those who had ever heard the name understood. They read the headline, and their eyes lingered longer than usual. Some veterans sitting in morning cafes stared at their phones, hands trembling as memories of lost comrades surfaced. Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted. The young soldiers were no longer loud, replaced by uneasy silence. Some quietly packed away the targets. Others glanced at Claire before quickly looking away. No one laughed anymore. They stood straighter, as though an invisible ceremony had just taken place. The woman they had once dismissed walked on through the afternoon sun, her back straight, her shadow long across the sand. No fanfare, no flags, but the silence around her had changed. It was no longer the silence of doubt, but of reverence. Claire walked slowly past the rows of seats, seeking no eyes, offering no smile. The notebook remained tucked inside her jacket, as if it would never be opened again. She knew today's victory wasn't hers, and she had no need for recognition. But the sunlight glinting off the scoreboard where the new record still flashed forced everyone to admit the truth had shifted. An acknowledgement, however quiet, had been given. At a distant corner, a group of older veterans gathered. They didn't speak much. They simply touched the brims of their caps with calloused fingers, a small but solemn gesture. It was their way of saying thank you, in place of what could never be written down. One of them murmured, "Finally, they see." Days later, a small memorial was held at Miramar National Cemetery. No reporters, no cameras, only those who had known Ghost 12. They laid flowers, read names, and when the team leader's name was spoken, many eyes turned toward Claire. She stood quietly, not crying, only tightening her grip on the notebook in her hand. For them, her presence was proof that the sacrifices of that year were still remembered. Back in San Diego, the night shifts in the emergency room continued. Claire put on her white coat and did her work under the cold hum of fluorescent lights. Her co-workers still called her the quiet one, still joked that she never came to parties. But somewhere at Coronado, a few had begun to speak her name differently. No longer just the nurse, but the one who broke the record. For Claire, it didn't change much. But in the eyes of the community, silence had become recognition. And sometimes, that mattered more than any medal. The Coronado beach stretched wide under the pale purple of dusk. Waves beat steadily against the shore, leaving behind lines of white foam that dissolved and vanished as if they had never been. The wind carried the salt tang of the sea, mixed with damp sand and the faraway scent of the ocean. At the edge of the beach, Claire sat alone, her back against a worn backpack, eyes fixed on the vast horizon before her. In her hands, the old notebook was open once more. The pages, creased and yellow-stained, looked as if they had weathered a storm from another decade. From between the lines of faded ink, something small slipped out, rolled a few times across the sand, and came to rest, a silver coin etched with the number 7. Claire bent down, picked it up. Her slender fingers traced the worn surface, feeling the grooves of each engraving as though touching the hands of those long gone. This was no ornament. It was a vow, the keepsake of Ghost 12, The final coin a teammate had pressed into her palm, a mark of an unbreakable bond, a family that once stood together in the dark. She looked at it for a long time. Sunset light poured through her gaze, catching the coin, making it glow like a fallen star lying on the sand. Then, with a motion both firm and tender, Claire set the coin down. She let the tide reach in, seize it, carry it away. Each retreating wave spread the wet mark wider across the sand, until no trace remained. You kept your word. Now it's my turn. The whisper dissolved into the wind, but carried far like a brief hymn, not meant for anyone else, only for her, and for those who were no longer here. From above, the sudden thrum of rotors broke the stillness. Whump, 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 the familiar beat made Claire lift her head. A UH-60 swept across the horizon, its shadow stretching long over the sea, the rhythm of its blades pounding back against her chest like a heartbeat. To most, it was just another training flight. But to Claire, it was a sign. A silent salute from the sky, as if the old spirits were still watching. In that instant, she was no longer forgotten. No longer an anonymous nurse in a small hospital, no longer just a visitor on the firing range. She was part of an immortal legacy, an unseen but irreplaceable piece of Ghost 12. Far down the beach, a few young soldiers lingered after drills. They saw Claire, saw the simple gesture, and none of them laughed. They stood still, silent, as if witnessing a sacred rite. One slowly raised his hand to the brim of his cap, a gesture solemn, unspoken, but deeply natural. The others followed. It wasn't a formal military salute. But on that Coronado evening, it was the greatest acknowledgement Claire had ever received. She closed the notebook, tucked it carefully into her backpack. Her footprints pressed into the sand as she walked, each step steady, unhurried. Claire wasn't seeking applause or spotlights. She only wanted to keep living, carrying Ghost 12's memory not as a burden, but as a quiet flame lighting the road ahead. The beach still echoed with the sound of waves, but inside Claire, the old noises had softened. The shouts, the ripping of gunfire, the roar of rescue helicopters, all of it blended together now, no longer torment, but a somber, peaceful song. The story ended without need for explanation. The coin marked with the number 7 had become a symbol. Once a wound, now a healing. Once a loss, now a continuation. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.